Hello, and welcome to Kindred Spirits Book Club, the podcast where two grown ladies geek out about Anne of Green Gables. I'm Reagan Duffy. My co host today is Kelly Gerner, and today we are thrilled to introduce you to our guest, Dr. Benjamin Lefebvre.
Well, hi, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us today. So, we have been dying to pick your brain for ages, really, but especially about the Blythes Are Quoted. And we really appreciate you making the time for us.
Oh, are you kidding? I've been really looking forward to this. So thank you very much for having me. And thank you for all you're doing to talk about Montgomery's work and to attract existing readers and new readers. So thank you.
Thank you. That means so much to us.
It is a labor of love.
Sometimes more labor, most of the time, it's lots of love. Well, let's introduce all of our listeners to Benjamin Lefebvre. Benjamin Lefebvre lives in Kitchener, Ontario, and has been publishing work on Ella Montgomery for over 25 years. He's the author of the novel In the Key of Dale and the editor of the Ella Montgomery Library, which republishes Montgomery's extensive body of shorter works. His most recent book is a volume of essays entitled The Glory and the Dream, Ella Montgomery's Writing Life. You can find him online at benjaminlefebvre.com and at the website for Ella Montgomery Online at lmmonline.org. We will put those links in our show notes so everybody can find that.
Then, anytime we have guests, we always like to get them started with the same couple of questions. So, we would love to know, first of all, how did you come to Anne and Ella Montgomery? What's sort of your Anne of Green Gables origin story?
Well, oddly enough, although I remember watching the second Megan Follows miniseries adaptation of Anne of Green Gables when it aired when I was a kid, but it was really when the spin-off series Road to Avonlea started in 1990 that really got the ball rolling for me. So I'm one of the many, many people, the surprising number of people who came to Montgomery through screen adaptations.
Mhm.
But because it was really a spin-off television series, it meant that my first experience of reading Montgomery's work was the non-Anne books. So Road to Avonlea was based on two pairs of unrelated books by Montgomery. So The Story Girl and The Golden Road, and then two collections of linked short stories, Chronicles of Avonlea and Further Chronicles of Avonlea. So I started with those. Didn't really know what to make of them. I did not read a lot of short stories when I was a teenager. And as a way of showing how, I've never really been the typical Montgomery reader, the same year that I got really into Road to Avonlea, I started two other lifelong television interests. So Saturday Night Live and Twin Peaks, which are probably as far away from Montgomery as you can get. And then when I was about 15 or 16, one of my parents got a catalog in the mail, something like Barnes and Noble, advertising the Anne series. So the 8 books in that Bantam paperback edition. I ordered the set and then I kept going. I grew up in a part of Quebec that was primarily French speaking. So I didn't have access to English books except when we went to Montreal on vacation or for some reason, or when relatives died in the United States. We would go there and then we would often stop off at a bookstore. So I relied a lot on the mail. And so this is before the internet, before Amazon, before online shopping. So there was a bookstore with a 1-800 number that you could call, or I could call and give them my father's credit card number and I would pay him back for my paper route money. And it sounds very quaint, I guess, but it meant you needed to know what you wanted. You couldn't browse. So like, well, I like this author, I will buy everything by this author. And for Montgomery, it meant, okay, the Pat books, the Emily books, the other novels, journals, letters, literary criticism. And so the reason I'm still at it 25 years later is that there's still more to read. There's still more to discover. There's still more to figure out about Montgomery's work. For a lot of people, the experience of reading Anne of Green Gables or Montgomery's work more broadly was finding Anne to be a very relatable character, wanting to be Anne, wanting to have
Mhm.
Anne as a best friend. That wasn't my priority. What I found fascinating about the television series is the sense of community and the humor. So Road to Avonlea in Canada aired as part of a time slot called CBC Family Hour. And these were shows that were designed for young people and adults to watch together. So they weren't kids shows, they weren't adult shows. So the focus was on both adults and young people, young characters. I don't think I picked up on this at the time, but in hindsight, what I realized is that, okay, this is Family Hour, and the focus of this television series is on an orphan girl and her two spinster aunts. You do have the nuclear family next door, but this is about alternate families. And I found that really daring for the 1990s, even though Road to Avonlea has this reputation for being, much like Montgomery's work, straightforward, kid friendly, girly. It's actually more complex than that, and a lot more interesting to me.
That's so fascinating to hear that whole separate journey that is so different from, I think, a lot of other folks and the way
Yeah.
that they come to Ellen Montgomery's work. So now I'm really, really curious. What is your favorite and least favorite Montgomery book?
That's a really tough question because I don't want to say that emotion does not enter this. I don't want to, make myself come across as, like, well, it's an intellectual endeavor. I don't have emotion like that because that's not true. But there's so many favorites in the sense that there's so many of Montgomery's books that I find fascinating. Her journals I find fascinating. The last few weeks, I've been rereading later journals from the 1930s and 1940s, and not just, what I usually do, which is kind of go looking for something in particular and then kind of skim around a bit, but really reading them from cover to cover. They're just really fascinating. And even a least favorite, Kilmeny of the Orchard, which is by far her least reprinted book and arguably least successful and most problematic book, to me still has redeeming qualities, or at least points of fascination, simply because it was an expansion of a fiction serial called Una of the Garden. And I recently republished Una of the Garden in its entirety for the first time in a collection of Montgomery's fiction serials that came out at the end of 2025. And so part of my work was basically comparing them line by line and saying, okay, what did she change? What did Montgomery do to this serial to basically double it in length to make it look like it was long enough to be a book?
That's really interesting. We recapped Kilmeny of the Orchard as kind of like an add-on to one of our seasons. I don't think I had read it since I was a teenager. That episode is pretty much Kelly and I being like, "What is happening?"
It's a roast. It's an hour-long roast.
But again,
we did find
fascinating
things to like about it. Like you said, there's a lot of things about that book that are really beguiling, and then there's a lot of problems as well, but it's an interesting one for sure.
Yeah, because it's her third book and Montgomery's reputation as a novelist hasn't gelled yet. Right. So it means that, and remember too, in 1910, she was L.M. Montgomery. I mean, she still is, but there was no Lucy Maud then. Nobody knew that it was Lucy Maud. Nobody knew what L.M. Montgomery stood for. Right. And in her periodical fiction as well, like her hundreds of short stories, she was able to write about boy characters and male characters because she wrote under L.M. Montgomery. So it seems like Kilmeny of the Orchard now, with her reputation being like, oh, she writes for girls or writes primarily about girls and women, and now there's a male protagonist.
Yeah.
Now that we have her larger body of work, we know it, and her reputation as a certain kind of writer has gelled for so long. It seems like a weird anomaly, but she still had options as a writer in 1910. I mean, I say this is not her idea, and she regretted doing it even before it came out. So,
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
In another life, she became like a gothic romance author.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had another question I wanted to ask you about then, and this is just my own ignorance about sort of Canadian culture generally. So you had said that you grew up in a part of Quebec that was primarily French speaking. Does Ellen Montgomery and Anne of Green Gables, does that loom as large in French Canadian culture as it does in English speaking Canadian culture?
Yes and no. So Anne of Green Gables was translated in Europe twice. So in Switzerland in 1925, in France in 1964. But it wasn't until Kevin Sullivan's miniseries appeared in 1986 in French that the French Canadian translation came out. It was
Wow.
a joint publication endeavor with Édition Québec Amérique in Montreal and Ragweed Press in Charlottetown. So Ragweed had distribution rights for the Maritime provinces, and Québec Amérique did in Quebec. And then subsequent to that, they republished the bulk of Montgomery's book-length fiction in translation in the next decade. And the Emily books had already appeared with another publisher, and 4 or 5 of her books had appeared elsewhere. And what's fascinating there is, although the cover art has changed from edition to edition, the whole, oh, she's a children's writer, that kind of, that reputation that kind of weighs down people who make decisions about cover art now didn't translate. So what I remember years ago was the bookstores in my hometown would have littérature québécoise, so Quebec literature, and littérature étrangère, literally foreign or strange in the sense of foreign literature. Montgomery was under Quebec literature. Even though she's not a Quebec writer, she was claimed as our literature, or literature from here. And her work was in the adult section, right?
That's
She was a
unusual.
serious adult writer. And like, I remember the blurb for Anne of Ingleside basically said, like, this is, like most of her novels, this is a satire of narrow-minded provincial people, right? Or some, I'm paraphrasing, right? But yeah, the idea of like, no, she's a children's writer, Anne is a role model for real girls, that's not part of the publishing journey in French.
Wow, that is really fascinating because if you picked up Anne of Ingleside and it had said that on the blurb, you would go into it very differently than I think most of us first read Anne of Ingleside.
I just think that's so fascinating. What it would have been like to pull one of these books off the shelves with the context of it as adult fiction instead of children's fiction, or specifically fiction for young girls, just how differently we would be talking about these books. I mean, I think the three of us and, people who are working in the Ella Montgomery scholarship community do correctly take her very, very seriously as an author, but that's not really the widespread, I guess, sort of take. I wonder how much of this just comes down to like what part of the bookstore she's in.
Yeah, I also want to make it clear that I'm trying not to be one of those people who were like, oh, she wrote, she didn't write just for girls, as though writing for girls is necessarily uninteresting, unsophisticated, uncomplicated, or unworthy of scholarly attention, because it is. To read her alongside Betsy Tacy or Jean Stratton Porter or Alcott or Burnett, well, of course. But still, Anne of Green Gables was not published initially for children. But because it's about a child, well, then it must be for children. But I don't know how then you explain Anne's House of Dreams, which has no children in it. Anne of Ingleside has a chapter where Anne says, "Oh, I don't want Walter to know about this because this is not child appropriate." Well, then how is the novel that it's in supposed to be for children? I'm always fascinated by new editions that just cling so tenaciously to this idea that no, Montgomery is a children's writer, so anything Montgomery wrote must be for children.
Okay, well, as you see, we're already getting into it. So before we go any further, if you are not yet following us on Instagram, you really should. We are at kindredspirits.bookclub, and we have curated a warm and lively space for you. And if the podcast has been brightening your week, would you please take a moment to rate or review us? It is a small thing, but it does help other listeners find their way to our book club family. And one other wonderful way to support Kindred Spirits Book Club is to shop our bookshop.org link. We've linked the books that we discuss in our storefront, but you can buy any old book you like using our affiliate link, and we will get a small kickback. You are supporting not just our show, but also indie bookstores, so that is a win-win for everyone.
Well, today we are going to be talking more in detail about The Blythes Are Quoted. Last episode, we recapped it for you, which we admit was a little tough to do because of its different kind of format, but it brought up a lot of questions for us. It's so different from the other books that we spent the last 88 episodes talking about. So we are delighted to have an expert here with us today to get into it. We usually start our episodes with a kindred spirit of the episode, and this book is a little tougher to choose a kindred spirit for. What do you think, Ben? Is there someone you think of as a kindred spirit of this book?
Well, yeah, I had to scratch my head over that one. I kind of think Walter, ultimately, because Walter is 12 at the beginning and he doesn't appear in too many scenes, but his poetry lives on. I mean, 20 years later, they're still reading his poems. So Anne is definitely a thread that links the book together, but Walter as well.
Yeah, we really noticed when we were reading it that even when Walter is not appearing on the page, in so many of the short stories or in those little vignettes, there's all these references to Walter as a poet, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a negative way, but it does seem like many, many people in Glen St. Mary writ large throughout the Blythes Are Quoted are talking about and thinking about Walter in some way, and almost always in relationship to poetry and what that
Mhm.
means.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Walter is an excellent kindred spirit for us to take into this discussion. For our quote of the episode, we are actually going to use a quote from your foreword to the Blythes Are Quoted because it sets up the experience of reading this book so very well. You said, "This final book certainly asks a lot of Montgomery's devoted readers, but these revisions and reconsiderations add to her legacy rather than take anything away from it. This familiar and unfamiliar book can surprise as much as it delights, but beneath the moments of despair and regret, Montgomery's sense of humor, her uncanny ability to paint human interactions, and her compassion for people's failing all shine through." It really sets up the experience of reading the Blythes Are Quoted.
Especially this idea that the book is both familiar and unfamiliar. It is so thoroughly, it's so wholly Ella Montgomery book. And then she keeps taking these sort of like hard left turns with some of her thematic elements that you're like, wait a second, this is not what we talk about. This is not what we come to Montgomery to read. And she's kind of saying, well, yes, actually, this time it is. So that's what we want to get into today. So, for today's story club, we are returning to the Blythes Are Quoted. This book is unique for many reasons, and its journey to publication is inextricably linked to our guest today. We are delighted to have Benjamin Lefebvre on today to discuss his work with the book and to share some of his insights with us. So, you will recall that in our last episode, we recapped the book generally. And while we had some kind of like off the cuff reactions, we didn't really get into any analysis of the text. So, today, with Ben's help, we're going to try to do some more of that and discuss some of those themes that make the Blythes Are Quoted so memorable, so familiar, and so unfamiliar. As sort of like a very brief background, everyone, The Blythes Are Quoted is the final installment in Ella Montgomery's famous Anne of Green Gables series. Maud submitted it to her publisher on the day of her death in 1942. This unique work remained largely unseen by the public until its complete release in 2009, having previously appeared only as a heavily edited short story collection in the 1970s called The Road to Yesterday. Now, Reagan, you and I both read The Road to Yesterday as kids, being Montgomery completionists, of course, and neither of us really felt like it made a big impact. We didn't return to those short stories again until we read The Blythes Are Quoted for this podcast. So I'm wondering, Ben, what about you? You said that you started with her short story collections. I'm wondering if The Road to Yesterday was among them, and how familiar were you generally with these short stories before experiencing them together as part of The Blythes Are Quoted?
Well, as part of my initial binge read of everything Montgomery had written and that had been republished in those Bantam Seal paperbacks, yeah, I basically read everything or what I thought was all of her work. So her 22 works of fiction. And then in late 1993, Bantam Seal added two more collections. So The Road to Yesterday was one of them. And then a 1979 collection of stories called The Doctor's Sweetheart and Other Stories were both added in that format. And I thought, oh, I thought I had everything. So I had read it and I just took for granted what I was told, which is that
Mm.
Montgomery had called this book The Blythes Are Quoted, and it featured a short introduction about Anne and her family. And the introduction was removed, and it appeared in lightly edited format as The Road to Yesterday. So I had no reason to question this. In 1998, during my undergraduate degree, I presented a paper at a conference hosted by the Ella Montgomery Institute about Walter. And in writing that paper, I befriended a scholar in Scotland named Jennifer Litster. And she had come to the University of Guelph, where there's an extensive Montgomery archival collection. And she's the one who said, oh, yeah, no, that's not true. That whole The Road to Yesterday is The Blythes Are Quoted minus a short introduction. No, 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 no. And so, with her permission, I published the paper on Walter with her notes from The Blythes Are Quoted as footnotes in that article. And so the summer of 1999, after I finished my undergraduate degree, I had a short window of time to go from Montreal to the University of Guelph to go to the archives. And I asked to see the typescript, and then they wheeled it out. And I like, oh, there was like a lot of poems in here. And oh, there's a lot of dialogue. And then I was leafing through some of the short stories, and I thought, I don't remember that from the Road to Yesterday, and I don't remember that from the Road to Yesterday. And then they wheeled out 2 more typescripts. They said, do you want to look at these too? And I'm like, 2? So for most of Montgomery's books, what survives is a handwritten manuscript. There are 2
Mhm.
stages between manuscript and book that haven't survived. So her own typescript and page proofs. So the typescript would have been what she'd sent to her publishers. So her publishers discarded them. And then page proofs would have been sent to her. She would have corrected them and then she sent them back. So there are 2 stages that are missing, right, for most of her books. For the Blythes Are Quoted, there is no handwritten manuscript that survives, but there are 3 separate typescripts typed on at least 2 typewriters, and they are all different in terms of chronology, in terms of what is included, what is not included, in terms of time as well. Montgomery makes different decisions about, are these Anne's children or are these Anne's grandchildren who coincidentally
Mhm.
have roughly the same names? So to make a long story short, I was so fascinated by this puzzle that I wandered into the English department at the University of Guelph and I said, I'm starting a graduate degree in Montreal in a few weeks, but could I like come here instead? And
I
yeah,
love it.
like this was mid-August and I started in September. They pulled
Wow.
some strings and they let me in.
That's a great story. You're like,
Yeah.
this mystery has captivated me and I must be here to study it.
Yeah, I had to go where Montgomery led me.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there are still a lot of mysteries about the Blythes Are Quoted, and one of them is, well, what happened?
Right.
So of the 3 typescripts, one, so she would have used paper with carbon, so she would have had like a top copy and then 2 carbon copies. I eventually figured out was the last of the 3 versions because none of them are dated. One copy is at the University of Guelph archives, and the other carbon copies are at the archives of her publisher. So it
Mhm.
arrived, but I went to the archives and I said, is there any correspondence that survives? Is there any note? Does anyone say, like, turn this down because, or acknowledge a receipt, or, well, she just died? Like, no, no. So the only clue that I found was in her obituary in the Globe and Mail that said, during the past winter, Mrs. MacDonald compiled a collection of magazine stories she had written many years ago, and these were placed in the hands of a publishing firm only yesterday.
Mm.
And yesterday being the day of her death. So it's possible that Montgomery dropped off the typescript herself the day of her death. It's also possible that Montgomery asked one of her sons to drop it off for her, and somebody else in the family would have had to know about it for it to be mentioned in her obituary. Now,
Mhm.
this is long before I or anyone or more than a few people had any real sense of how Montgomery had died. So, okay, she dropped it off, or it was dropped off the day of her death. Is that possible? Like, could that have happened? But the mystery about her death was also unsolvable because I did not have access to anyone who could solve that mystery. So I didn't know how to answer that question. So it's still a mystery.
Wow. I didn't realize that was still a mystery. I assumed it as fact because it's written down,
Right. It's
but
part of the lore.
But the only clue is that it was dropped off. A collection was dropped off. I don't know if there could have been another collection. The fact that copies are in the McClellan and Stewart archives, and one of them has a title page with with her American and Canadian publishers on it. So okay, it arrived. And so this was before Mary Rubio's biography came out and before Montgomery's granddaughter, Kate McDonald Butler, went public with her family's interpretation of her death as a suicide. And so when that news broke, which did not surprise me, but it was the kind of thing where we knew but we didn't know, and this really had to come from somebody who had firsthand knowledge, and so we had to wait until they made those choices. But once that was made public, I thought, okay, well, if Montgomery's death was a suicide, then depending on how lucid she was, it is possible, it's more possible that she dropped it off herself. In her journals, she mentions dropping off Anne of Ingleside, published in 1939, to her publishers in person. So there was a precedent for that. But we don't know. There's no way to prove or disprove or to know with certainty. There's simply no evidence that I found up to this point.
what do you know about why her publisher didn't publish it at that time and then eventually chose to publish The Road to Yesterday?
There too, you could only speculate because I have not found any evidence. I mean, it was April 1942. Montgomery is critical of the war. Like, war went on till 1945. It's a collection of poetry, short fiction, and dialogue. In a sense, Montgomery repeated what she had been asked to do 30 years earlier with Chronicles of Avonlea, which is, can you rewrite some short stories to make them a sort of about Anne and Avonlea? Not Aveline anymore, Glen St. Mary at this point. And she had published a volume of poems in 1916, The Watchman and Other Poems. It did well for poetry, but it didn't do well compared to Anne's House of Dreams, published the following year. And people will compare those sales figures of those two books and say, like, well, yeah, she wasn't that much of a poet. No, poetry just doesn't sell as much as her fiction did. So she's repeating what she's already done. I'm surprised that they didn't publish it anyway, because she had just died and there was a resurgence of interest, which I think is typical when someone has just died. So what ended up happening with The Road to Yesterday is, as I've best been able to piece together, is that Stuart MacDonald, Montgomery's youngest son, found a copy of an earlier typescript of the Blythes Are Quoted in a trunk and brought it to a different publisher. So some sources say that Stuart MacDonald edited the Blythes Are Quoted into The Road to Yesterday, but from what I can tell, it was done by an in-house editor, and I have not been able to identify that person. So there are photocopies of the typescript with stuff crossed out. So they chose to undo the experimental blend of genres and make it into a conventional collection of short stories.
Which makes sense. Obviously, those had done well before all of those other collections of short stories. I mean, well-ish.
Yeah, except that reviewers hated The Road to Yesterday.
Ah.
Overall, they did not like it, but this is where it gets complicated, because I think it's what we were talking about earlier with, like, her reputation as a certain kind of writer, and this is not the same kind of book. You know, the book is quite long. The Blythes Are Quoted, as it is quite long, and so taking out poems on the vignettes and trimming the short stories, I'm not surprised that they did that, but to me, it made it less coherent, because 20 years pass between stories, and that's not as clear on their own, right? Without the vignettes, Anne and Gilbert and Walter are spoken for or spoken about far more than they appear. And I think, and a lot of people have kind of identified that as a weakness in the book.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your process was in editing and preparing this manuscript for publication?
I tackled this first as my master's thesis at the University of Guelph. I guess it sounds like a humble brag, but my thesis was so thick that they thought they might have to bind it in 2 volumes. That's just because the manuscript itself is so, I mean, I had scholarly stuff around it, but Montgomery's book is so long. The first thing was figuring out, well, which ones last? Like, one of them is a draft. There's like stuff crossed out. Montgomery's changing her mind. That clearly is early. The other two, which one's the last one? And I ended up picking the wrong one. There were clues that it just seemed the first story, Some Fools and a Saint, is in the type draft. It's in the last one, but it's not in the middle one. And I thought, well, it doesn't seem likely that she took it out and then put it back in. So it seems more likely that she just kept it and then took it out. So there were things like that where the middle one seemed like the last one. So I think my thesis is the last one, but then bits that were not in there as appendices, or maybe I changed my mind in the end. I don't remember. So anyway, I changed my mind, but my goal was to not touch it. Right, to make it as close to what was on the page as possible. So I did not add anything. I did not correct. Like, she misspells Roy Gardner's name as Gardiner, like Pat Gardiner, not Gardner. Charlie Sloane comes across as Charlie Pye, right? And people took me to task for this. Like, well, why didn't you fix this? It's obvious. Don't you know it's a, like, yes, I know it's a mistake. I know it's a mistake. But when the author is dead, you can't correct them.
You don't have an editorial relationship with Montgomery herself where
Yeah.
you can sort of circle it in red ink and send it back to her and clarify.
Yeah. And I specified I made these changes and I did not make these kinds of changes. But in the end, the publisher said, well, no, we want somebody else to write a forward. So all the stuff that you're going to write, and they want it to be as brief as possible, we're going to stick it in the back. So they got Elizabeth Rollins Epperly to write a foreword, which was great. I'd known Betsy for a long time. She's a very close friend. I thought, great, yay. But the difficulty was that her foreword analyzed the story and my afterword provided context.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It really needed to
so
be
you have to
flipped.
swap that.
Yeah. So 9 years later, when Penguin decided to reissue it as part of Penguin Modern Classics, I said, could we flip these around? Because I think it just makes more sense to start with
Right.
context and then end with analysis. So we did. But basically, the big challenge was convincing editors that this book had a market because despite the fact that it did not seem appropriate for 9 to 12-year-old girls. Nope, I'm not going to argue with you about that, but there's a broader audience in that, and they just didn't see that. So ultimately, what happened is in 2008, well, several publishers got on the bandwagon with the centenary of Anne of Green Gables, and Penguin Canada had done really well with a prequel by Budge Wilson and 100-year anniversary edition of Anne of Green Gables with the original cover, not the original text as it turned out, but the original cover, and a book by Betsy Epperly. There was a facsimile edition of some of Montgomery's scrapbooks. So those had done really well, and they had just seen for themselves that Montgomery's audience was wide, even though bookstores would put these books under 9 to 12 classics because that's where Montgomery goes, as everyone knows somehow. But that in practice, everyone is reading Montgomery.
Right.
So they said, okay, well, let's do this next. And then after that, we did an annotated edition of Real Love Ingleside, where I collaborated with my colleague and friend, Andrea McKenzie.
You talked about the sort of bookends that you and Elizabeth Rollins Epperly wrote for the Blythes Are Quoted. Why was it important to provide that context for this book? Is it because it was like released so much later and we sort of wanted to like catch the audience up on what had been going on or how we got here, or why we were releasing this book decades and decades down the line? What were sort of your goals in providing that context and analysis?
Well, to me, the reality was that some readers had read Anne of Green Gables years ago and had not read the sequels, or had read some of the sequels, but not all of them, or had read them but didn't realize that they had been published outside of chronology, or who knew them from Kevin Sullivan. The Montgomery audience is just so broad in terms of what they know or what they don't know. Some people have read the journals, some people don't know that there were journals. So depending on what a reader has already read, something like this, where this is book number 9, it's just tricky. So, and it seems incredibly different. But my experience 25, 30 years ago, when I read it, I thought, oh, there's a lot going on here. This is, never before seen gritty realism. She's never done this ever. Then I reread some of the books, and I reread Anne of Windy Poplars and all of those scenes where two spinsters who are the last surviving members of their extended families tell Anne in great detail how all of their relatives died. And both of those had extra anecdotes that her American publisher asked her to cut, but they appeared in the British edition of Anne of Windy Willows.
I think that your point is so well taken, that we have this idea of these books as being so wholesome, so family friendly, so accessible for everybody, but you really don't have to peel that many layers off the top to realize that there is an awful lot of gritty realism happening right under the surface.
That's a good point, Cal. Like this idea of, we think of Montgomery, and we often talk about like Montgomery as comfort reads, as places we go back to revisit that always feel like familiar and comforting and wholesome. But a lot of the books, you're right, you don't, if you're not paying attention, you can kind of let some of that stuff slide on past without registering too much. But a lot of the books, once you start peeling a couple of layers back, there is much darker stuff lurking underneath, I think, for a lot of things. So Ben, what do you make of this book in general?
Yeah, do you like it?
Yeah.
Were you like genuinely like, I I love this. I'm enjoying it. I'm all in. Or were you hooked more by like the mystery, the experimental nature, the ways that it was so different from some of her other work?
Well, I think it was both. I mean, again, I had read the Road to Yesterday. I kind of accepted it as this fairly odd but not terribly consequential collection of short stories. And when I read it with the poems and vignettes and then the different versions and again, this is the only well, I'm catching myself because I've learned the hard way that it's not to say things like first, last, always, never, only, because you never know what's going to come up and kind of refute everything that you just said. I can say it's one of the few texts where we have multiple versions and not just Wendy Pablo's Wendy Willow's, where clearly it was copy edited differently and the punctuation is all different. But, besides a few anecdotes, like it's essentially the same, but the Blythes Are Quoted, there are substantial differences. So the short story, The Road to Yesterday, in the middle typescript that was used for the collection, The Road to Yesterday, Suzette goes back to a farmhouse and then she meets someone who she assumes is somebody that she grew up with, and then they spend summers together with Anne and Gilbert's kids. So this is now World War II. So Anne's kids, like this does not make sense chronologically. So in what I thought was the final typescript, which is the version that's in the Blythes Are Quoted, Suzette King is reminiscing about Anne and Gilbert's grandchildren, which likewise does not make any sense chronologically.
They'd be too young,
So
right?
exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So Montgomery is trying different ways to make this fit the chronology. And what is she doing? And why does she keep changing her mind? So those were the things that I found really fascinating. And then there was a bibliography of Montgomery's shorter works, but most of Montgomery's later poems hadn't been found yet. As more and more print sources have been digitized, I found most of the poems. So there too, okay, this is from 1921. This is from 1919. This was in a book. This was in Maclean's, and the short stories as well. I found two more short stories just in the last year. There are still a few that I don't know where they came from. So there too, you can compare versions. So yeah, it's just mystery after mystery for me, and so that's kind of what keeps me going.
Yeah, it is. It's an ongoing kind of literary mystery.
The funny thing, though, is that I didn't reread the Blythes Are Quoted after I corrected the proofs and sent them back to the publisher back in 2009. I always meant to because I have copies of all the typescripts and there are, all of these discrepancies between them. And there are some weird things that I don't even remember because I found them so long ago and I never really did anything with them. But I didn't reread it until I was writing the last chapter in my new book, The Glory and the Dream, because I definitely wanted to talk about the Blythes Are Quoted, but I didn't have a lot of space left. So I reread it for the first time in, I guess, 15 years. And it still fascinates me because I don't think this made Montgomery that unusual, but the short story as a form, Montgomery said at some point in her journals that she found writing a novel easier than writing a short story because a short story, it takes more effort to say less. But also as a form of art, a short story can end in an ambiguous way, in a way that a novel, like a novel, needs closure. You've been following an arc for 80,000 words. You want the happily ever after ending,
Yeah.
right? She believed in this. She undercut her own endings, I think, but she wanted that. But the short stories kind of end in a more ambiguous way, more consistently. And so again, Montgomery isn't unusual in terms of those choices with short fiction versus longer fiction. But a collection of short fiction is a little bit odd because it means that you have 12 or 15 stories that all end ambiguously, or a lot of them end ambiguously. And then sometimes Montgomery, when part of her revision process was to add not just mentions of Anne and Gilbert, but mentions of earlier short stories and later short stories. So A Commonplace Woman, one of the last stories in the collection, is the sister of David in Retribution. So you have two
Right.
extended deathbed scenes. So in revising them, even though these scenes happen like years apart from each other, they're connected through relationship. These original stories don't have anything to do with each other, but she connected them together in those ways. Those two particular stories, I haven't found them published anywhere, and possibly Montgomery couldn't find a publisher for them or a magazine that would take them, but they do survive in typescript form. And so because most of her shorter works survive only in published form, so unless she published something twice or three times, there's not much to compare to. You just have the finished form. But here you have a typescript and the revised version of the Blythes Are Quoted, and you see how she changed her mind about things or expanded this or cut that or made changes to character names or place names or various details like that.
I love the fact that you pull out those two kind of deathbed stories. I think those are the two stories that I found the most shocking in the Blythes Are Quoted. And add to that this sort of the intensity of the tone of both of those stories is really surprising, really unsettling. I wonder what other readers how you reacted to seeing those. Like you said, they hadn't been published previously. How other readers have reacted. What does it say about Maud that that's what she was thinking of, that's how she wanted to end the Blythe story, with some of these really intensely dark moments that accompany a person's time of death?
Well, I think there are a couple of things to think about, and this is part of the mystery, is did Montgomery choose those stories because she wanted death to be so omnipresent throughout this book, and or did she pick these stories because like, well, I wrote these a while ago and I couldn't place them, so I'll attach them to Anne and Gilbert, and that'll make them more publishable.
Right, like, is it practical or is it thematic? Or is it
Exactly.
both?
That's the thing. It's not necessarily one or the other. If Montgomery's death was by her own hand, how long before her journals contain a lot of, especially in her last years, a lot of explicit like, I wish I could die. I can't face this. I wish I could just not wake up in the morning. How serious was she? For how long was she serious? We can't answer these questions. There's no evidence that survives. But I started to see the Blythes Are Quoted as her extended suicide note. Because if it is the case that Montgomery dropped off or arranged for this to be dropped off the day of her death, let's say that's possible, what was it in this book that she did not want anyone to see while she was alive? And she's writing so much about death and looking back on life and regrets and scandals, or the things that would have been scandalous but ultimately are meaningless. Whether or not Montgomery died by suicide, it's clear that the book has all of this retrospection and also the war, looking back at the
Right.
war. So on one of the typescript pages where it says the first half of this book takes place before the Great War, the second half deals with after the war. On one of the typescript pages, the words Great War, the word great is crossed out in ink, and above it says First World. That's all there is on this page. It would have taken her 90 seconds to roll in another page, another sheet of paper into the typewriter and retype that sentence. If you accept that there's no such thing as a coincidence or an accident, one way of looking about this is that Montgomery wanted part of her record to be, yeah, it was the Great War. But now that there's a Second World War, we have to go back and reimagine this as the First World War.
Meaning that potentially many more world wars.
So she believed, and this is very much part of Real Love Ingleside, that this is the war to end all wars. Walter sacrificed his life and his future as a poet in order to create this new world. And Walter says in his letter to Rilla, not in a few years, as so many people foolishly think, but the next generation. So we're sowing the seeds now, but the next generation will reap the harvest. And here we are, the next generation, and it's the Second World War. The book shows reconsideration. So in a way, it doesn't matter how she died. We won't ever know for sure.
Yeah.
What did she intend with this manuscript? She doesn't say. There are no sources that I know of. But the book itself shows somebody who is thinking about death, thinking
Yes.
about life, thinking about sacrifice, and is called upon to rethink the vision that she put into Real of Ingleside and her own work. And she's once again turning to the Anne characters to do this.
It's really interesting reading this right on the back of Rilla of Ingleside. If we had done our seasons in publication order instead of internal chronology order, this book has a lot more in common with Anne of Ingleside. Thematically, it has a lot more in common with Anne of Ingleside, even though, but it's directly seems like it's commenting on Rilla of Ingleside. Like that seems to be very present in Montgomery's mind throughout this book. All the references to Walter, it seems like she's almost reckoning with Rilla of Ingleside. Like that seems to be a lot of what the wrestle is. Rilla is a rather pro-war book overall,
Yeah.
war being a necessary sacrifice.
We spent a whole episode talking about all the different sort of justifications for war that Montgomery puts on the page from the perspective of many different characters. And then you get this book, and then you get Walter's poem, The Aftermath. And maybe that's the author's own evolution, right? Playing out in real time. But reading these, these things are standing in stark opposition to one another.
Yeah, and the Piper in the Blythes Are Quoted is not at all what it's supposed to be in Real of Ingleside.
No.
Where's the call to arms
Yes.
and pro-war sentiment and patriotism? And instead it's eerie, haunting, beautiful. It's an interesting piece, but it's not what we were told it was going to be in Rilla, right?
No. Well, I have two bombs to drop concerning the aftermath.
Okay, please.
So I mentioned that of the last typescript, there was a top copy and two carbon copies, and two of those copies ended up in the McClellan Stewart archives at McMaster University. In a bibliography of Montgomery's work and shorter work in archival holdings that was published in 1986, I thought, there must be a weird typo, because the typescript for the Blythes Are Quoted, or the copy at Guelph, is 629 pages, but the copies at McMaster are 626 pages. When I went to McMaster to look at these, I thought, oh, okay, this is the top copy, this is the carbon copy, and all of that. But then I went to the end. Montgomery crossed out the aftermath. So the version that she apparently submitted or arranged to submit for publication, the poem starts like kind of mid-page, and so she crosses it out, and then the last pages, including the last conversation between Jem and Anne, are missing. I put it back in.
Yeah.
Because I
Understandably.
thought, no. We need that poem. We need that
Yeah, we do.
Yes.
So I overruled Montgomery a little. Like, I justified it by saying, like, it's in the typescript in Guelph, it survives. So I'm not adding something for the sheer hell of it, or adding something that she did not intend. I just put it back because I thought she wrote this for Walter. That wind that yesterday morning was so blithe. I mean, come on.
Yes.
But then, because of course there's always a but then, I was looking at old Montgomery's handwritten manuscripts, which are at the Confederation Center Art Gallery in Charlottetown. And if you've seen Montgomery's handwriting, you know that it's very difficult. And Montgomery's revision process was very convoluted. She would have like A1, A2, A3, and then Z27, right? And so piecing it together is another puzzle. And then you flip the back and look at, okay, what sheets of paper did she write on? And that's also fascinating, because her husband's sermons, business correspondence, like, I didn't know she had an agent, but she did, and her letters are on the back. On the back of a page of Jane of Lantern Hill, which she wrote in 35 or 36 and published in 1937, there is, I forget if it's the first or the last half, but it's the aftermath.
Really?
Interesting.
Yes, I know. Like, you're both staring at me like you're very flabbergasted. I was very
little.
flabbergasted.
I am.
Because, like, wait, the wind that yesterday morning was so blithe, that's not about Walter? Like, that's not a pun? Like,
Right.
Right. That's the way we assumed it was. I mean, that's not a coincidence, right? Blythe.
right. And this is World War II looking back at World War One. Right, right. But no, apparently not. It's Montgomery in 1936 writing a novel, and this is a poem that she submitted. Couldn't find a publisher, couldn't find a magazine that would take it.
Wow.
And then, and I think it's the second half, because I remember that it had the line, "The wind that yesterday morning was so blithe," because that's just seemed, if it had been the first half without the second half, you could think, oh, well, maybe she added that to make the connection to Walter. But no, I think it was the second half.
Yeah.
So, that part of the game that people talk about, like, if we could have like a dinner party with 12 dead people, like who would they
Right.
be? I mean, I could think of a few relatives I wouldn't mind inviting, but really, I kind of want to sit down with Montgomery and say, can you explain to me all of these things?
Yeah.
Yes.
What were you thinking, or what was going on for you, or why?
And it's interesting because we are not deep in the journals. We're not deep in the lore. We came to the podcast as primarily from the stance of fans, not academics. But one of the things we've been learning from getting a chance to get to know so many folks in the academic community is how well documented she has made her life through her journals and how she was obsessively recopying them and editing them. And they're in so many different forms. So it's interesting that somebody who
Mhm.
was being very specific about
Mhm.
what she was leaving in her journals is also intentionally or not intentionally leaving some of these mysteries, considering how much access we have to all of this other stuff that she has written, journals and letters and things like that. There's still stuff that she is not telling us or telling people.
Yeah, I agree. She was very meticulous, except when she wasn't.
Which
So,
tells you something, right?
yeah.
So, can we talk a little bit about some of these little fireside vignettes that are happening between the Blythes in response to some of the poems? Content wise, they're not a lot. They're very small bits of conversation, not a lot of commentary or follow up, kind of leaving us to wonder what do you make of what she was trying to do with some of these vignettes?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. It's similar to the question that we talked about earlier about, okay, retribution and a commonplace woman. Was that, okay, I have death on the brain. I'm going to write these short stories about like extended deathbed scenes on purpose? Or this is just what I have. I don't have a lot of energy. I'm just going to pull from things that are handy. In her journals, so Montgomery doesn't write a lot about her actual process of writing her fiction. And so if you look through her journals for like, well, okay, what did she mean when she wrote this or this novel or that novel or this scene or that scene? You'll be disappointed. But if you pay attention to what she does say, you can pick up some clues about her writing process. So she did a lot of pre-writing. So she would call this spade work, and very little of it survives. So we don't have evidence of it, but she would basically map out everything. At some point, she mentioned, like, oh, I just finished the dialogue work on maybe Jane of Lantern Hill. I don't really remember. So by the time she wrote like, okay, chapter one, she had everything figured out. She had pieces already done, and she would just kind of weave it all together. So with that in mind, it is possible that what ended up on the page of the Blythes Are Quoted was she did this dialogue with the intention of creating larger scenes out of it and then just ran out of energy. Because again,
Mm.
there's a lot of mystery in terms of the last few years of her life. So the latest she could have written it is the day of her death. The earliest, I don't know. Her journal stopped in the middle of 1939. Her letters continued to her two surviving sets of correspondence to G.B. Macmillan in Scotland and Ephraim Weber in Western Canada continued. So there are a few clues there. For a while, she was toying with the idea of a sequel to Jane of Lantern Hill called Jane and Jody, but it just didn't go anywhere. When did she start writing this? How much energy did she have? Why did she write another novel? No one knows. So it could be that this was her plan to be dialogue and poetry. It could be that this was meant to be the start of broader scenes and it just didn't happen.
Oh, that's interesting if we think about it that way, that maybe, and again, we'll never know. There
You
was
never
some
know.
intention to flesh out what was happening in those dialogues. The dialogue would have been part of something bigger, something, there might have been some more narrative around that. Because it
Yeah.
does seem sometimes the dialogue kind of makes sense, right? Like as a specific commentary on the poem. And sometimes it seems a little random in some ways, right? Like it's only tangentially related to the poem. I'm thinking about the little like Jem yelling in through the window for pie and Susan thinking to herself, I wish Walter acted like that. Like hungry? I don't know. Like what did that really have to do with what the poem was? So it feels like there maybe was something more there. I don't know.
I just think it's interesting with the structure of vignette poems, short stories. Sometimes the thematic through lines are really present and clear. And sometimes, like you point out, Reagan, it just seems kind of arbitrary in a way. And yeah, I don't know. One of the many mysteries of this book.
Well, to me, one of the most fascinating things about the book was Montgomery's decision to do that retconning about Anne suddenly being a lifelong poet.
Right.
So in Anne of Ingleside, Anne writes an obituary poem, which coincidentally is a poem that Montgomery herself published under her own name in 1906, I think. And she had never written a poem before. And now the Blythes Are Quoted is like, oh, I wrote this when Matthew died. I wrote this when I was teaching in Avonlea. I wrote this at Redmond. I wrote this on my wedding day. Did you?
Yeah, this is the first we
Interesting.
knew you were writing stories. We knew you were writing narrative fiction. We had no idea you were writing poetry.
Well, and that Walter's poem survived because he says, "I'll never write the poems I dreamed of writing," but
And yet we
somehow
have
you
had
did
many.
after all.
Yeah.
What's also interesting is that the couple of poems of Walter's that are specifically mentioned in Rilla of Ingleside are not in this volume. I mean, there's whatever we got of the Piper that is not, it's not Walter's Piper from Rilla of Ingleside. It also says that he wrote like a series of sonnets to Rosamund or whatever that's supposed to be thinly veiled Faith Meredith. Like those aren't in there either. So where are all of these poems of Walter's coming from, right?
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about kind of the way that Montgomery is shoehorning the Blythes into all of these short stories, because that really struck us when we were reading it. The way that the Blythes are characterized in all of these short stories. I mean, kind of obviously shoved in to me.
And because they are, as you pointed, shoehorned in, or Reagan, you had the best possible phrasing of this in our last episode, where you said that everybody in Glen St. Mary has a case of mentionitis when it comes to the Blythes. Like you can't do anything. You can't do anything or say anything without referencing some member of the Blythe family. It's so odd. Because of that, what ends up happening is that the characterizations of some of these folks who we've grown to love so much and who we know so well now feel very wrong to us or kind of flat. I think I saw this most prominently with Anne. We don't have any of that sort of like vivacity and enthusiasm that we associate with her, especially in the earliest books. And every time she's referenced in the Blythes Are Quoted, she's either described as like a great beauty, right? Which is, I love that for her. But, she's like a woman, in her 50s and 60s, and they're all like, oh yeah, that Anne still as beautiful as ever every time she's mentioned. Or she's like a saint. And so while I suppose this means that perhaps she has realized her childhood ambitions of becoming angelically good and divinely beautiful, it does seem like maybe it came at the cost of her personality. So I'm wondering, Ben, what you kind of make of her characterization, and then also tell us what you think about Gilbert's characterization, because I think that one's a little off too. He's lacking a lot of the warmth that we see in earlier books. Let's put it that way.
Well, the thing though, Kelly, is that, yeah, she's angelically good and divinely beautiful, and I guess she's dazzlingly clever, but we don't see a lot of that here. But even if you think, okay, Montgomery's overdoing it with the praise, every once in a while you'll get somebody saying something downright nasty about Anne in particular, or the Blythes. I hate the Blythes, or that Mrs. Blythe makes me sick.
But one of the things that Reagan and I also sort of were talking about is anytime someone does critique the Blythes, then that seems to be sort of a signal to the reader that we're not supposed to trust their opinion, right? That's an unreliable narrator.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, this is called the Blythes Are Quoted, not Anne of Glen St. Mary, right? So the whole subject place thing, it's flipped around. So the Blythes are objects of gossip in this book. They are talked about a lot more than they appear, especially in the short stories. And for that reason, there are a lot of things where anytime somebody criticizes the Blythes, then it's a sign that we're not supposed to trust them. But they don't really get their comeuppance in any way, and you're kind of left to pick it, you're kind of left to wonder. So to me, the praise is also like that. Sure, maybe this is true, but it's so overdone that, and this could also be Montgomery's way of saying, wasn't it Sherlock Holmes where Arthur Conan Doyle got so sick of the character that he killed him off? And then there was such an outrage, and there was the demand for more was such that he kind of had to bring him back to life.
Right.
I think Montgomery could be doing that too. It's easy to assume that, oh, her publishers forced her to write all those sequels. She really didn't want to. And the truth is more complicated than that. Like, I think, she wrote Anne of Windy Poplars in large part because there was a film version of Anne of Green Gables, and she didn't get any money for the movie. So she thought that a new Anne book would, and it was the Great Depression, and it made good business sense. In Anne of Ingleside, she was in a vulnerable state, and the comfort that you both mentioned earlier about rereading these books and connecting to past selves and all of that. That was her experience of writing Anne of Ingleside. What was her state of mind like when she wrote the Blythes Are Quoted? I don't know. And so is she trying to poke holes at the reader, say, please, I want you to get tired of these characters so you'll stop demanding more of them. But then again, even though the book ends with the words the end, the last vignette means it is called au revoir, which is French for till we see you again, not the end.
Mm.
So who knows?
Yeah. It's almost like she feels that own her duality with these characters that maybe so defined her legacy, right? The way that Anne
Yeah.
really defined her writing life in terms of being tired of them to a certain degree, not having anything more interesting to say about them, and at the same time not quite being able to leave them either.
But at the same time, it was actually really brilliant of her to connect these stories and poems that may not have, some of them were published in magazines, but that's very fleeting, right? So when she was asked to write Chronicles of Avonlea, it was that like there's such a demand for Anne that if you bring Anne into a couple of short stories, we can sell a whole collection on that and people will buy it. And it won't really quench people's thirst for Anne, but it'll give them something until finally you're ready to write Anne going to college. So I think something like that might be happening here.
Do you think this changes how we should read the earlier books in any way?
So Wendy Poplar's filled the gap between Anne of the Island and Anne's House of Dreams. Anne of Ingleside filled the gap between Anne's House of Dreams and Rainbow Valley. Here, Walter is 12 at the beginning, the same age he is at Rainbow Valley. So she's now superimposing two books. And because there are these mentions of Anne as a poet, and I wrote this after Matthew died, I wrote this on my wedding day, I wrote this at Redmond. So Montgomery is including a lot of these throwbacks to the past in ways that you don't get that much of in Wendy Poplar's and Anne of Ingleside or even Rilla of Ingleside. So I think Montgomery herself invites that reconsideration, like, because now Anne's a poet and Anne has always been a poet. You didn't know that, but now you do. And that changes something because now she's finding here's another form in which Anne is expressing herself. A lot of readers have been disappointed in the way that Anne's writing career kind of takes a back seat. Like there's just hardly any mention of it, and Anne poo-poos her own writing all the time. But now we see Anne as a writer. So that's another thing that the book invites readers to reconsider.
This has just been an absolutely fascinating discussion. But we'd love to pivot for a minute and we want to talk a little bit about your newest book, The Glory and the Dream. This book is a comprehensive exploration of Ella Montgomery's professional and private life, and it's examining the contrast between her publicly optimistic persona and her internal battles with clinical depression, which culminated in the 2008 family revelation that her death was a premeditated suicide.
Yeah, I mean, what I've always found really fascinating is so Montgomery went to Canadian Authors Association event in 1928. And so in her journal, she writes about her own experience of being there, giving a speech, being hounded for autographs. And she mentions that someone, like a young fan, didn't want an autograph. I just wanted to touch you, Mrs. McDonald. So she wanted a hand clasp, right?
Ooh.
So that's what Montgomery writes about in her journals. Then if you look at the Toronto Globe, so a national newspaper, they reported about it and they report on different details. And then a year later, Maclean's magazine in Toronto also wrote about that experience. So now you have three versions of the same event and they all touch on different experiences. Montgomery, not surprisingly, is writing from like what it was like for her to be there. The newspaper article and the Maclean's article are writing about the experience of hearing her speak and being aware that she's on a panel with three men. Everyone is here to see her. Everyone wants to see her. So that's not something that Montgomery wrote about. That's whether or not she was aware of it. So as more and more print materials from that era or from any era have been digitized, they're now made text searchable. So over the years, I've spent a fair amount of time in front of microfilm readers going through old newspapers and looking for proverbial needles in the haystack.
Mm,
Now that things are text searchable, you can find things a lot more quickly and in sources that you never even knew existed.
right.
And so that's helped me all of these ephemeral sources, ads, interviews, commentary, like tributes after her death, obituaries, they show how Montgomery was talked about during her lifetime and the assumptions that people made about her or about what her work was like. And this is all kind of lost in the sands of time. So
Mhm.
now this whole, oh, Montgomery, children's classic, 9 to 12, all of her books are the same. That's what people think about as Montgomery now. That's not how people wrote about her when she was alive.
What an incredible project. It makes her lived experience like three-dimensional. You're not just seeing her own perspective, but also the perspective of the wider world around her. And it's one of these things where it's like, I think there are probably few people who have like retained the level of fame, right? She was very famous in her time. She has retained that level of fame. You know, we still care about this. We still care about Ella Montgomery as an author, and we want to know how people in her own time are reacting to her. That's really special. And it's special that you had the opportunity to peruse all those archives, use those different digital resources to do that, and be able to create that more fleshed out picture of like what it was like, not just to be her, but to live in her time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's been fun. And again, you learn the hard way not to use words like first and last and only and never and always, because you'll never be done. You never know what will be digitized next. You know?
The mysteries will continue to unfold.
Yeah. Well, and
Uh,
especially if someone who published as broadly as she did. I mean, 500 short stories, 500 poems. Yeah, it's kind of exhausting after a while because I often have so many tabs open that you can't see the tabs anymore.
yes.
You've just disappeared into oblivion, reaching out into forever.
Yeah,
I'm familiar. I'm familiar with this.
yeah.
This is Ben, as you were doing this work and doing this research, what were some of maybe the disconnects that you saw between her sort of public persona and her private life?
Well, one of the things that hasn't changed is that Anne of Green Gables is by far her most talked about book. And to an extreme, it's the only book people talk about. And so in some of the tributes after she died, people would say things like, well, she sold Anne of Green Gables for $500 and never made any money, despite how many copies it sold. Okay, but that's one book. That was an urban legend that she had sold the rights to Anne of Green Gables for $500. She did not. But because some sources have kind of like they only mention Anne of Green Gables, it's like, well, that kind of implies that $500 is all she ever earned for writing, which of course is patently untrue. So stuff like that, where it's like, oh, okay, that hasn't changed, right? So the assumption about who she wrote for and how her books are meant to be understood in terms of target audience, that has changed. And but I say this, there are Montgomery did say in her journals, well, once, I can't believe that's such a simple little tale, blah, 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 with a juvenile audience in view. Montgomery was trying to do the whole, modest woman
Mm.
thing. And of course, the sales of her book were very unusual. But what makes her exceptional is that unlike everything else on those bestseller lists that she appeared on, most bestsellers last 3 years and then they're gone and no one remembers them. Montgomery is one of, as you said, Kelly, is not only an author we're still talking about her 70 plus years after she's died, but her books were bestsellers and they've endured. And that's not supposed to happen. She's an author whose books continue to be read and bought by the general public. That also makes her unusual, not just as a Canadian writer, but a writer of any nationality.
Why do you think that that's the case? Why Anne of Green Gables? Why does this book continue to endure for so many generations?
The easy answer is that it's a good book. In addition to that, it's been helped along by screen adaptations, stage adaptations, tourist sites, popular culture, scholarship. But the publication of Montgomery's journals starting in 1985 also became a turning point. The publication of the first volume of the journals coincided, like it appeared merely weeks before the Canadian premiere of Kevin Sullivan's Anne of Green Gables. So that kind of did two things. First, the miniseries was a huge success, so that drew new people to read the books or to reread the books. But then the journals turned the conversation away from like, oh, but she's not like Anne of Green Gables. She was a real human being, like a flawed, complex human being, like all human beings.
Right.
I didn't know that. I did not expect that. So maybe Anne of Green Gables is not as straightforward a book as I thought it would be if the author was a real human being. That changed the conversation, and then it just kind of ballooned. It's kind of like this momentum every time there's an anniversary. Like in 2008, Anne was everywhere, more so than Montgomery,
Yeah.
until in September, the Globe and Mail published K. Macdonald Butler's article about her family's belief about the circumstances of Montgomery's death. Finally, the conversation became about Montgomery,
Mhm.
even though Butler's article appeared under the title "The Heartbreaking Truth About Anne's Creator." So
Mm.
Anne overshadowed Montgomery even in the article about her death. And now, more recently, Anne with an E became a huge hit all over the world because of Netflix. The new play that premiered at Stratford Festival last year, I saw it twice.
Did you guys like it?
I loved it.
I know. We did too. We loved it
I
so
did.
much. Yeah.
Because okay, they commissioned a new play adaptation of Anne of Green Gables, which has been done 2,500,000 times,
Yeah.
right? What else can you do? Well, clearly there's more you can do, and clearly there are new ways of thinking about this. And so I always find adaptations fascinating because of how they reimagine the story and add to the story and make choices about what to include, what not to include. I mean, among my book collection, I have all these graphic novel adaptations that are set in the present and where Anne is queer in every single one of them. I mean, I think that tells you something about how people imagine the
Yeah.
character. That's great.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. We could obviously talk all day. Can't wait to see you in Charlottetown for the conference because we have more to talk about. So,
Definitely.
but we like to kind of end our episodes by being inspired by Anne or the book of the episode by recommending something. I will kick us off. I am going to recommend that, inspired by the academic life that we got a little peek into with our conversation with Ben today, I'm going to recommend the Love's Academics series of books by India Holton. The first one is called The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love. The second is The Geographer's Map to Romance. And the third just came out. It's called The Antiquarian's Object of Desire. So I haven't read that one yet. And they're like historical slash fantasy slash romance. They're very fun. They're kind of steampunk magical in quasi Victorian Oxford. And in each of them, a pair of academics is studying or researching a specific magical phenomenon. And of course, discovering their feelings for each other along the way. She plays with a lot of fun romantic tropes, lots of witty banter, silly hijinks, clever plotting, very fun and light reads. I'm sure they resemble real academic life in absolutely no way whatsoever, but I have been enjoying those tremendously.
I like those books a lot too. I like India Holton a lot as an author. I think she does that sort of like fantasy Victorian world really, really well. And I think if you like those Emily Wilde books, this
Yeah,
is like a really good read alike.
yes, totally.
I'm gonna kind of build off of your recommendation, Reagan. If you want more academic mysteries, the book I wanted to recommend is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. So what happens in this one is set in alternate universe Yale. It's really inspired by this idea of like mysterious houses at American Ivy League universities where it's like, skull and bones and things like that, and how these become like seats of power when I'm sure they're just like glorified fraternities. So what Leigh Bardugo is kind of playing with is what if these houses were actually run by magic users? Then who sort of polices or keeps an eye out for the magic users? And so she introduces her protagonist, Galaxy Stern, who is called Alex, an unassailably cool name by any standard. Alex can see ghosts, and she's recruited by a specific house that sort of oversees all the like magical rituals of the other secret societies at this alternate universe Yale. And it is an academic mystery, and it is fun, and it is kind of campy, and it is very sexy, and it's just a really, really fun series. So the most recent installation, I think the third book in the series, came out this past month, but the first two are absolute bangers. Go read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo.
I agree. I like those books a lot. Ben, do you have anything you want to recommend?
Well, I think there are two Montgomery related books that I would recommend that I think are really fascinating in terms of complementing the Anne books. So one of them is by Elizabeth Rollins Epperly, which is Imagining Anne. And this is a facsimile edition of some pages of Montgomery's scrapbooks. But these are scrapbooks of clippings and fabric swatches and basically doing an 1890s mood board. And you can see how bits and pieces of the Anne books kind of, you can see where they come from in terms of Montgomery's imagination, and how before Pinterest, you'd have to like do the clipping with scissors and glue, and how she kind of created these visual archives. And so what Epperly does is kind of find the links between what the clippings are, and here's what they've identified some of them, and she kind of connects the dots between what's on the scrapbook pages and what's in Montgomery's fiction. So that's one recommendation. And the second one is a novel by Melanie J. Fishbane called Maud. It uses archival research and Montgomery's journals and surviving sources to kind of imagine Montgomery herself as a teenager. So primarily out west, where she spends a year in what is now Saskatchewan, living with her father and his new family. And there are boys, and there's kissing, and there's friendship, and there's writing, and there's ambition, and what a lot of Montgomery's books are about in terms of like that push and pull between individual ambition and societal expectation that appears in this rendering of Montgomery's life as well.
Excellent recommendation. We love Melanie. We met her at the conference last time. We can't wait. We've got to have her on the podcast at some point to talk about Maud, because her book is great. That's a great recommendation.
Ben, it has been such a pleasure to geek out with you today. And listeners, if you want to know more about Ben, we will drop all of his information in our show notes. But don't miss out on The Glory and the Dream, Ella Montgomery's writing life, which released early this year, right? This February. And that's widely available at this point. You should be able to get it wherever you buy books typically. And that is going to be just a really, I think, illuminating look into Maud's life as an author, as she was understood and revered in her time. And we're just so thrilled to get to talk to you about it today, Ben. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you both, Kelly and Reagan, for this opportunity to be part of the conversation that's now, 90 episodes strong. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh my God, truly our pleasure. So if listeners do want to follow you or want to know more about your work generally, you really have contributed so much to Montgomery scholarship. What is the best way for them to find you?
The website for all things Montgomery for me is Ellen Montgomery Online, so lmmonline.org. And through there, I'm also on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. Listeners, if you'd like to support the podcast, the simplest way is to leave us a 5-star rating or review, or tell a friend about us on social media. Every review and share helps new kindred spirits find their way here. And because we are so grateful for your support, we will send you one of our Kindred Spirits Book Club stickers totally free. We aren't quite done with this season yet, so please stay tuned for our next episode as we begin to wrap up our time with the Anne books.
Thanks, Kindred Spirits.